Hey there, and welcome back to Build Explain. Last week in the Build and Chill series, we finished covering the basic tips for the wood types that are available up to the Black Forest biome. We also set up our first external building that we are currently using as our portal hub. So if you missed parts 1 through 4 of Wood Explain and want to learn in-depth details and stats about basic, core, and fine wood structures, there's a playlist available on the channel homepage to get started. This week, as you can probably tell by the title, we're going to be starting on the Stone Explain portion of this series. And for my returning viewers, hopefully you'll have noticed a bit of an audio upgrade. I finally have a high quality pop filter for my microphone, which is going to allow me to bring the mic much closer to my face and will hopefully reduce the amount of plosives in future content. Before we get started on our first stone build, we will need to make a stone cutting table, and to do that, we'll have to acquire some iron. This will require us to have beaten the boss from the Black Forest, and to have also explored a decent amount of the swamp biome. And without spoiling too much for the newer players, just know that this adventure will likely be the most tedious part of your playthrough's progression, as farming out iron for the first time is extremely time consuming, especially if you want to avoid building a whole new base just to be closer to the swamp. As always, once you've acquired a decent bit of iron, you'll want to use your new resources to craft as many new components and workbenches as you can in order to unlock all the corresponding recipes. In the case of iron, that's going to include things such as iron nails and the new stone cutter. This will unlock the recipe to create a new, faster ship with a lot more storage, making the trips to gather iron a lot smoother, as well as the focus of today's video, stone structures. Let's briefly touch on the stats of stone. And if these numbers confuse you at all, feel free to click the link in the top right to go all the way back to part 1, where I do an in-depth explanation of Valheim support and building mechanics, and what these values actually mean. Credit once again to the Valheim fandom wiki for the graphic and information. All stone structures have 1500 durability points, and share these resistances. They're weak to pickaxe damage, they're neutral to blunt / pierce, chop, and lightning damage, are resistant to fire and frost damage, and like most build pieces, are totally immune to poison and spirit damage. With this health pool and these resistances, this allows stone to take as many as 300 hits from a basic grayling, or as little as 4 hits from a 2-star troll. Stone also has a maximum support of 1000 or a minimum support of 100, with a 1/8 vertical loss and a 1-for-1 horizontal loss. Meaning under normal circumstances, you cannot place a stone floor to the side of another stone floor without some kind of higher tier support. However, stone structures are the first non-roof building pieces that we have access to that do not take rain or water damage, and can also act as ground for certain structures like fires and smelters, which is why we've had to wait until now to build something a little nicer for our forge. And if you're interested in learning even more about all of Valheim's individual build pieces, give the fandom wiki a visit by clicking the link in the description below. Now, let's get on with the build. If you watched part 3, you probably remember that when we created our forge area, we sort of just made a temporary fenced-in area to hold our kiln and smelter. Well, today I'd like to give them a more permanent home that will increase our smelting and crafting efficiency. Just like the portal hub, we need to clear a flat area large enough for the new forge building. And while the smelters don't take up too much horizontal space, the kilns are actually quite girthy, and if we want to have a meaningful amount of them in our forge, the building is going to need to be even larger than the portal hub. To keep the current aesthetic of our growing village, we'll build the forge in a similar fashion. The basic shape of the building will be an octagon, and the length of each wall will be 10 meters to compensate for the size of the structures that we need to house. So be sure to clear an area large enough to account for this. And one last thing before we get started on the actual building, let's go over the materials we'll need. Shout out to Vena Resende for this idea. For the construction, we'll need 1 workbench, 1 stone cutter, 1 forge workbench, 3 kilns, 3 smelters, 34 stacks of stone, 26 stacks of wood, and 4 stacks of core wood. These numbers are actually rounded up to allow for some variations in the build, but close enough that you know around what amount of gathering you need to do to get the build up to today's progress. We'll start by placing 2 4x2 walls near the back of the work area, ideally with the long side perpendicular to the main base. Then place two 1x1 cubes vertically on both sides of the walls. This will give us the 10-meter length as we mentioned before. To make the octagon shape with stone, make sure that your next structure's placement snaps both external corners to the outside position. Doing this for all corners of the walls ensures that all walls will be the same length with the same snapping point positions, saving us from having to break everything later when the floors don't line up correctly. Perform this 6 more times while leaving an opening for the wall opposite of where we started. This will be our doorway and will require a slightly different design for our purposes. To adequately fit our forge on the inside of the building, the walls will need to be 6 meters tall, or in other words, they need to be 3 large walls high. But to keep the pattern of stone from looking jarring, we're going to use a sort of bricklaying pattern to break up the texture. I also want to include windows for this build, so for the second row we will only use 2 4x2 pieces on the outside of the walls, leaving a 2x2 space in the middle. Do this for every wall except for the doorway. For the third row, we will simply repeat the first row's pattern all the way around, again except for the doorway. Something you may have not known is the basic wood door is the only piece in the game that has a fractional meter snapping point. So with enough patience, you can actually get a half-meter snapping point to allow us to center things a bit better than we used to. We are going to use this trick to center a gate door on the forge building. So first, let's start by adding 2x1 stone walls to the bottom. Then, place a 1x1 wall to the center 2x1, but our wood door won't quite snap correctly with just one. So we need to put another one across the center like so. Now the door will snap correctly, and the snap point we are aiming for is the one that is slightly away from the front of the opening. Delete the 1x1s and use the door as a snapping point for your first gate. Then, delete the wood door and attach a second wood gate to the first. Next, let's fill in the space around the gate by using a similar bricklaying technique that we did for the walls. Once we hit the top of the door, we'll continue the pattern from the rest of the walls from row 3. Now we'll soften up the lines with some archways over the doors. Like the portal hub, we'll make this building with a 2-meter overhang. And like the portal hub, we'll start by adding 2-meter beams perpendicular to the top of the walls. To save on resources, we're only going to use 2 beams per wall, and 1 beam for each corner. To center the beams appropriately, just use a 2-meter beam to give yourself a 2-meter snapping point. Delete them after the beam is placed, and perform this for the entire circumference. Frame in the beams we just placed with 4 meters snapped on the beams on the center of the wall. And again, just like the portal hub, we will add vertical beams down from the corners, but this time be sure to use 2-meter beams as we will need their snapping points later. Put those snapping points to work by adding 45-degree beams for a little extra detail by making joists for our posts. Before we continue on, this is a good pause point for the build if you need to farm up stone and wood. Here we have a decent place to house our smelters and kilns if we don't quite have the daunting amount of resources we need to finish the build. From here on is where the build starts to get really expensive, as the roof is going to have a lot of detail and each stone floor we place is going to cost 6 stone, and we are going to place a lot of them. Start by adding the external floors. Each wall will have 6 floors apiece, with the middle line centered on the middle of the wall. For the doorway floors, you'll need to offset them by 1 meter from the center block. The rest of the walls are just a matter of placing the floors on their natural snapping points. Now let's add the stairs. One of the favorite things that I discovered on my own is making the appearance of rounded staircases, so we'll implement that here. Place 2 primary staircases on the inherent snapping points centered on the door. Then, while looking at the ground, rotate the staircase 1 turn away from the original stairs. This should lock the stairs' corners together while slightly offsetting their angle. Place the stairs and repeat the process once more. Do the same thing for the other side, and now you have a pretty cool way to build your wider staircases. All that's left for the outside wall is to build our railing. This time I want to use core wood as the actual handrail. We'll still use basic wood for our supports, but I think core wood gives us a nice contrast to the gray of the stone. With the railing finish, let's get to the more complicated stuff, starting with the internal floors. There's a lot of references to part 4 of wood in this video, but if you did watch it, you'll remember that we place floors by starting on the front, back, and left and right walls. We'll place them on the given snapping points from the walls, and continue to build them out until they begin to intersect. For the smoothest result, Make sure the floors are snapping to the original pieces that you are building from, and avoid snapping to floor pieces coming from the other walls. Once the floors for the main walls are finished, fill in the gaps by placing just enough floors to fill the empty space. This will prevent textures from clipping too much and keep the floor from looking sloppy. We'll leave the open space in the middle for chimney and fire that we'll build later. Now I hope you've been working on your wood stockpile more than your failing relationship at home, because we're going to need a lot of it. Time to work on the roof. For this build, we'll start by snapping 26-degree roofs to the overhang framing that we made earlier, allowing the roofs to clip through each other on the edges. Double check your work, because some of the snapping points can be a little tricky. After the initial row is placed, continue this pattern for 2 more rows. And before moving on, let's head down to the bottom to place any pieces that we may have missed from the top, and to triple check our work. With the bottom side work completed, now we need to climb back up to the top and replace any roofs that we needed to destroy and make sure that the entire roof has a symmetrical pattern. Once that we're sure that the first 3 rows are complete, let's head down and begin building the chimney system. Use stone pillars on the ground in the opening we left earlier. Snap them to the front and back floors. Fill in the spaces between with a layer of 2x1s, and yes, this will leave a small gap. That's okay, and will actually have a nice function later. Build up the pillars 6 tall on all 4 sides, and then climb back up to the roof. Once you're back up, build up the center 4 roofs until they make contact with the pillars we built. Use the same overlapping method we used on the lower rows before. Now add the last layer, and be especially careful in your placement here, as the higher we go, the more difficult it becomes to fix. For the finishing touches on the roof, we'll frame it and detail it by using wooden beams again like we did with the portal building. Add one more beam to the very top to get our chimney crown. And the roof is finished. The build gets pretty simple from here, so if you had some frustration like I did with some of the placements on the roofs, don't worry, we're in the final stretch. Go back inside your finished structure and start placing your kilns and smelters. I like placing them on the sides to cover up some of the floor overlaps, and so the forge itself can be centered on the back wall. Make sure your placements are as even as possible, as even one being off is going to throw off the entire interior's look. Place your forge's upgrades as neatly as you can. And at this point, your forge is fully functional. Let's add some of the final details. With the ancient bark from the swamp, you also unlock the ability to make bonfires, and it just so happens that the chimney in the center is the perfect size to hold one, so we'll add one here for our interior lighting. And now we'll add some sconces for the exterior for just a little extra bit of finesse. By this point, you should have a fully functional forge. And while there's a few extra details I want to add, I'm going to save those for when we have actually covered all of Iron's stats. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, and if you have, be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel to be notified of the next episode of Build and Chill. And if you have any feedback for the series, feel free to drop a comment below. As always guys, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week.